The government of Jamaica is being guided by strategic priorities this year. Topping the list of priorities is fiscal prudence and a roadmap to grow the economy and create jobs. Today, in this GI Special, Government on a Mission, we get a progress report on priority number 1, fiscal prudence and the pursuit of a credible economic program. I'm your host, Ian Boyne, and with me is the Minister of Finance, Planning and the Public Service, Dr. Peter Phillips. We thank you for your company. Minister, good to have you on this special. Could you tell us first, what are the main elements of this fiscal prudence program?
Well, essentially, as you know, the problem has been that we inherited an unsustainable debt. So that the heart of the challenge is essentially not to grow the debt. And that in turn means that we have to maintain very tight control of our budget. So that's the heart of the matter. Because we have in effect been spending more on importing goods than we are in fact earning from the export of goods and services. That has caused us as a country to have to borrow. That is reflected also in the budget itself. So that's the heart of the matter. And we have managed a program with the support of the International Monetary Fund and the other multilateral institutions, which has been aimed at rebuilding credibility through demonstrating that we are managing our debt downwards and containing the expenditures. But I want to add 2 other dimensions to what we have been doing, because our program also entails ensuring that we maintain a basic level of social spending to protect the vulnerable. And certainly that's one of the quantitative targets that are in the review program.
Actually, a quantitative target.
It's an actual quantitative target, and we have met that target. And we have also put specific targets for the amount of capital expenditure, because there's always a risk that as you manage down your expenditures, you end up sacrificing the development expenditures on your capital side. And this year, for example, we are spending about double what we spent in the previous year on the capital side, difficult though it has been.
So it is not a contractionary program at the expense of program growth.
No, it's
we have learned from other countries.
Well, we have learned from our own experience. Yes. But what we have been able to do is to ensure that even as we contain these expenditures, and a lot of the expenditures that have been contained are, interest expenditures, for example, on the debt as a consequence of the national debt exchange. We have been able to contain our expenditures on wages and salaries because of the agreements which we have had with the public sector workers, and by virtue of closer monitoring of expenditures and project implementation, as well as other recurrent expenditures.
Yeah. And so in terms of the indices for fiscal prudence, we have been doing well. The numbers are encouraging.
Yes, the numbers are encouraging. Debt is down as a percent of GDP. We are spending within the available resources of government. It's been very difficult. I wouldn't want to minimize the effects of this, whether it is in the road repair program, even though we have managed to do a lot of that with the limited resources available. But, there's a lot of hardship out there. But the fact of the matter is that the long-term solution to this difficulty is in creating an environment which facilitates not the government opening business, but private investors, small, medium, large, very large, undertaking the expenditures which will provide jobs and growth that will give people not seasonal work, you know, Christmas time, Independence time, or low wage work only, but work that is sustainable. And that's what we're trying to do. But the adjustment is a difficult adjustment, no doubt about it.
But the initiatives in tax reform are aimed at building out this economic program, aimed at stimulating growth.
Yes, I mean, that is not the only thing, but those initiatives, yes, I would venture to say is perhaps one of the more far-reaching set of reform measures that has been put in place over the past 2-3 decades, if not more, because what it does, first of all, is to ensure that you create a rules-based system that lowers that incentivizes producers, not just big producers who have connections and get access to ministerial decision makers or other decision makers, but everyone, and particularly the small and the medium, who are often not as connected, get access to these new rules-based operations. So it offers a set of allowances that did not exist before, more generous capital allowances, for example.
It does.
Yes, yeah. So that to everyone, so that you can write off the cost of the investment. So your buildings, your equipment, etc., are all written off in more generous, as I say, capital allowances on par with other things in the region. It also provides a very significant employment tax credit, so that persons who employ and have statutory expenditures by virtue of the number of persons that they employ are able to write off the cost of these employment-based expenditures. So that's an incentive not only to provide employment, but also to pay those deductions over to the whether it's the NIS, NHT, etc., education tax, because you can't get the benefit of the credit if you don't collect and pay over, because we know of the situation where many workers who are in need of the protection or access to a house, etc., have paid to the employer. It's been deducted, but it's not paid over.
Absolutely.
So this is in part a compliance measure. In addition, there are significant credits available for research expenditure and innovation that are available to businesses as an effort to kind of get Jamaica firmly anchored in the knowledge economy, which is what is driving the global economy now. I mean, you have done a lot of work in some of these areas to define what are the drivers of the modern world economy. We can't just continue to rely in perpetuity on an economic model that is predicated on low-wage labor. And so that sets a platform to incentivize research, development, patent registration, and the like for businesses that are involved in that. There are other elements. A complementary part of the tax reform effort involves changes in the customs tariffs regime. Essentially, perhaps the most significant part of this is to zero rate, in other words, to remove tariffs for all the inputs, the inputs into the production process, for manufacturers, for agricultural producers, for producers of tourism services, and significantly for us, for producers of entertainment services, so that they
leveling the field between
it's an
manufacturing and services.
It's an important part of our operations, and it provides for where there are goods that would otherwise be considered consumer goods, if it is part of your production process and you certify to customs
Yes.
that this is part of your tools of trade, so to speak, then you get it in zero rated. So sound recording equipment, for example, which might, for you, maybe just something for your
Right, consumption,
listening,
yes, right.
but for somebody doing,
That input of production.
Yeah.
We're going to talk about any possible downside to this omnibus legislation and whether there's still a need for special incentives. We take a break, but we'll be right back. Welcome back to this special presentation, Government on a Mission, looking at the strategic priority of fiscal prudence and the roadmap to economic growth. The Minister of Finance, Planning and the Public Service, Dr. Peter Phillips, is our guest. Minister, had raised at the break the issue of whether there's any downside to this omnibus approach to tax legislation, whether there aren't sectors, tourism for one, other sectors, which would still need special provisions, which would still need special incentives. Certainly that was the way that East Asia's economic growth was programmed.
well, you know, the truth is, take a sector like tourism. It's better off under the current arrangements that we have just put in place than it had before. It permits, for example, continuous refurbishing of the plant. They get tax relief on all of their inputs into the business, everything from batteries, air conditioning, equipment for rooms, etc. What, again, the rule that, as I said, what might be a normal consumer good for someone else, if as an input into their
Production process.
yeah, they get relief from these duties. So overall, they are in a stronger position. The second point I would make in that regard, though, there is still provision for large-scale and pioneering projects to receive special treatment. But that treatment now is going to be governed by particular rules and by a parliamentary approval process.
Oh, so it's not just ministerial discretion.
Not just ministerial discretion. And the regulations which we will bring to the parliament before the end of this calendar year, which will define what we mean by large scale and what we mean by pioneering. And what we mean by pioneering is not just that it is something that isn't now being done, but something that has to have a particular catalytic effect and technological intensity.
Innovative, yes.
Be innovative. So, you know, it has to have some science in it.
So in that way, it incentivizes knowledge intensity.
Knowledge intensity and moves the economy as a whole up the value chain.
Yes. So this approach to tax incentives does a number of things and creates a real virtuous circle.
Yes, you see, one of the things that we have to recognize, you know, is the nature of the system that we operated in the past. What you had was high rates of taxation, and then you negotiate exceptions for particular sectors. Now, that has a distortive effect because it means that investors flow into those sectors as distinct from other sectors, and those sectors may not be those that over the medium term give you the best return. So what you're seeking now is not to pick the winners, so to speak, but to make everyone, all sectors, potential winners. We think that the market has the best possibility of determining where the winners are likely to emerge from. And, you know, we know that sectors have emerged in the modern economy that no one in any public bureaucracy could have anticipated beforehand. The information revolution that has driven the world economy
Yes.
now that
Went to
everybody
the
has a
few, yes,
PC and a smartphone and
course.
everything. Never came
Not
out
at
of
all.
any decision of any
Or the
bureaucrat
bureaucrats.
anywhere.
Yes.
That came out of
Yeah. Market
individuals
conditions.
doing their
Initiatives.
research in an environment that
Encourages that.
rewarded this kind of innovation, that rewarded this kind of research effort, and where we create that kind of environment here.
Yes.
And also, I think a critical part of it, when you don't pick the winners in that sense, but allow everyone to be a winner, you give this small investor the equal chance to become a winner as the big investor.
Yes.
Because you're not saying that we are reserving these incentives just for the big, but that you really are leveling the playing field in that regard.
Minister, the divestment of assets, how is the government moving where that is concerned?
We're moving with very deliberate speed in that regard. The process in relation to the Kingston Container Terminal is far advanced. Enterprise team is at work. Similarly, with respect to our air terminal facilities, where what is being sought is to do something similar with Norman Manley as has been done with the Sangster terminal in Montego Bay. Cayman Strack Limited enterprise team is also up and running. So that's going. There are not a lot of assets in that regard that remain. But I think the evidence shows that the state is not the most efficient operator of enterprises in that regard. So that's proceeding.
The crucial issue of the management of public expenditure, management of ministries, department, agencies, parastatals. How is that going? How diligent is the government about that? Managing housekeeping expenses.
Well, I think all agencies are bound by the rules governing the budget, the FAA Act, Financial Administration Act. There is regular reporting. We have sought to bring all public sector agencies up to date with their annual reports, which are to be presented to Parliament. But the most significant area is that we have to address is in the whole issue of project implementation. And here we are going to be instituting rules that govern the selection of projects as part of a much tighter budgetary control mechanism, where there will be a 3-year public sector investment program, and projects have to go through an adequate preparation process, because oftentimes money gets voted for a project but which really isn't at the stage where it can be implemented properly, because it hasn't been all the preparation work, the drawings, the quantity surveys and all of that have not been done. So that's part of what we are doing. We are also going to be implementing measures in the course of this fiscal year regarding what we call a fiscal rule, which is simply put, to put measures in place to ensure that we don't run up a debt again for the future as we have in the past.
So you're going to legislate on that now?
We're going to legislate on that, and we're going to put parliamentary controls in place whereby any movement away from those rules has to be approved, justified by the Parliament, and that there are automatic corrective efforts. There are circumstances where your deficit may need to grow. For example, if there was a natural disaster and you had to put in place some expenditures, extraordinary expenditures to meet the requirements. God forbid that there should be such a disaster. But what we need to have in place is that there's a corrective mechanism that immediately takes effect, so that once you have overcome the disaster, you rein in the expenditures again and return to the path. We cannot bequeath to another generation the hardship and the travail that so many of the current and immediately previous generations have had to endure because of this high and unsustainable debt.
The issue of corruption is one of the issues to be dealt with in this whole fiscal prudence program. Eliminating corruption, setting up the mechanisms that corruption does not carry the kind of transaction costs which it traditionally has.
Well, you know, I think there is an effective platform that has been put in place: Corruption Prevention Commission, Parliamentary Integrity of Members Commission, Contractor General Commission. What has been agreed to by the Cabinet is that we should create a single anti-corruption agency with special powers. Because, you know, my experience, including experience in the Ministry of National Security, it has been the most effective deterrent to corrupt behavior and or criminal behavior is to identify the culprits, bring them before the courts, and make them pay the price for their actions. And to do that, it means that you have to have adequate investigative machinery and prosecutorial machinery to bring it about. And this, quite frankly, is a whole area of reform that is being addressed and needs to be addressed. We have provided some resources within our limited means to the Ministry of Justice to help strengthen the court system, to be able to allow for the appointment of additional judges in areas. I think there's going to have to be further measures to ensure speedier trials and efficiency. It makes no sense having a trial for something 5 years, 6 years, 7 years after the event. That creates a sense that life is a free-for-all and that you break the law with impunity. This is not something that we can afford to let continue. So that's an important chunk of the reforms alongside this whole issue of the single agency, single anti-corruption agency that we are already committed to.
Thank you very much, Minister. Government on a mission, the Minister of Finance, Planning and the Public Service, Dr. Peter Phillips, talking to us about the government's approach to fiscal prudence, the government's thinking in that area. After this, we're going to be having a panel discussion where we'll continue to explore these issues. Thanks for staying with us for this GIS special, Government on a Mission. We're looking at the strategic priority number 1, which is fiscal prudence and the pursuit of a credible economic program. In the previous section, we had spoken to the Minister of Finance, Planning and the Public Service, Dr. Peter Phillips. Now we speak to two persons from the private sector who will give their views on the government's strategies. We have with us in studio Ernst & Young taxation specialist Alison Peart and the head of the Department of Economics at University of the West Indies, Dr. Damian King. Good to have you both on the program. Just want to start with you first, Damian. Make the case for us for the government's pursuing this policy of fiscal prudence, for our doing things differently. Why do we need to do things differently? Why do we really need to tighten up on expenditure?
Okay, there are two reasons. The governments of Jamaica have been running unbalanced budgets for pretty much all of our independent history. For 50 years, we've been running fiscal deficits. That means that we've been spending more public money than we've been earning in terms of tax revenue. For most of that time, the difference has been small. Over the last dozen years, the difference has been large. Recently, so if we're going to be spending more than we're earning, it means we keep having to find new people to borrow the difference from.
Yes.
Recently, we've run out of people to borrow from.
That's true.
So once you run out of people to borrow from, then you have to stop doing it. You literally have to cut your expenditure because nobody's lending you any more money. So that plan had to change. So that is one reason why we had to sort of balance the budget. But there's a much better reason than that. When you constantly run fiscal deficits, you are running an economic program that ensures that your economy stagnates. Jamaica has the slowest growing economy in the world over the last 50 years.
Slowest growing?
The slowest growing economy
in
the world over the last 50 years. Some economies have done worse over short periods of time.
Yes.
Zimbabwe is doing very badly now. Uganda did very badly in the 1980s. Rwanda in the 1990s.
Yes,
But if you
Ghana.
look over the whole 50 years,
Jamaica.
we've been treading water for 50 years. Okay, and the reason for that is that we have so badly mismanaged our fiscal affairs that we run these large fiscal deficits, so we constantly don't maintain our infrastructure. We don't put enough into social expenditure. We don't maintain, social order. And so we never create a climate where the entrepreneurial spirit that the surveys tell us is alive and well in Jamaica, and the opportunities that exist because Jamaica is well located geographically. None of these opportunities we take advantage of, and the investment takes place and we achieve our economic potential. And so you cannot do that when you constantly run fiscal deficits and the government doesn't get to do what it is supposed to do, which is maintain a climate where the private sector can invest and take advantage of the opportunities. And so that is the reason why we need to get fiscal management improved.
Yes.
And the time has come now to do that.
But isn't there the danger, Damien, that with running this very steep demand management program, that there is not enough space for growth-inducing measures? If you're constantly restricting and clamping down on demand, where is the growth going to come from?
It's actually a good question because you might find yourself in a short-run, long-run dilemma. Because if you balance your fiscal budget by clamping down on demand, then you put yourself in a situation where the economy contracts in the short run so quickly, and you have so much economic dislocation with the threat of social unrest, that you sort of create a situation where there's no support for the reform, and the whole thing breaks down. So you need to manage it carefully. But it turns out that there's actually not much expenditure contraction in this program.
Okay.
If you look at, first of all, how they have gotten from 6%, from a fiscal deficit of 6% of GDP down to about 1%. A lot of it is done on the tax side. Much of it is going to come from the tax reform. And the tax reform essentially is taxing better.
Taxing better?
Yes. Taxing some things that have not been taxed before, reaching into parts of the economy that have escaped taxation. Some of it comes from transferring the surplus from the National Housing Trust. Some of it comes from savings on the NDX, which is money they wouldn't have been paying out to service debt. So it is not a big expenditure contraction on the expenditure side at all.
It's an important point.
The second thing is that the fiscal contraction in terms of the debt trajectory is actually stretched out. We don't get to 100% debt to GDP ratio until 2020. And the target for 60% of GDP is not until 2026.
Yes.
So it's actually quite gradual.
Yes. So it's not a radical adjustment.
It's not a radical adjustment by any means at all. And so even though you normally face that kind of conundrum, they're trying to be mindful of that.
Yes.
But the point is, it has to be done. At some point,
has to be done.
you need to face that, and it has to be done so that we can get onto a path where you get some investment and growth going.
That's the point the minister has been making. Alison, your views on the omnibus law. Is this better than what we had before?
I think it is.
It is? Why?
One of the issues that the government has always faced is the ability for the Minister of Finance to overrule the various tax acts and give anybody a tax incentive.
Yes.
In fact, some countries view Jamaica as a tax haven because with that ability, regardless of who the Minister of Finance is,
Discretionary powers.
his discretionary powers were such that he could just wake up one day, not saying he would, I'm just saying the ability to.
Yeah, that power.
Correct. Also, who manages his signature? How do you know, in terms of the internal controls, what is going on with the signature of the Minister of Finance if it's so widely, his powers are so wide? So part of the issue that arises from having such a broad discretionary power is that you may be finding that certain areas of the economy are getting tax waivers where other parts of the economy do not. People could argue that if I don't know the minister or I don't know somebody who knows him, regardless of who is in power, I don't get a waiver. The other issue that you get into is, I like to put it as waivers, that's cash. If you give away the ability to charge tax on something, it's no different than giving that person cash. So now that we have a much more uniform basis of incentives, whereby the minister now has one area which is restricted to 0.25% of the GDP. There's some restrictions on, and it has to be pioneering. There's one sector that gives him the discretion to basically assist. It makes it a much more level playing field for persons. Also, you could argue less bureaucratic. I say argue because some people are arguing that the shift is from the Minister of Finance to Customs. But the ability to access certain incentives doesn't mean that you have to fill out an application form, go to the Ministry of Finance or go to the Ministry of Tourism or go to various places and wait 6 to 8 to 10 weeks to get something approved. It's in the law. Also, it ensures that anybody can access it. Now, persons say, but what about the MSME? What about a small business person? You get a push and pull. If you put certain things in the tax reform to target the MSME, you could argue you're discriminating against others. So in terms of what the tax reform is right now, it's treating everybody the same, or it's attempting to give everybody the same treatment. The financial institutions or the regulated entities could argue that they're being discriminated against because they're at the 33 and a third. Everybody else will go to 25. When it comes to the incentives though, all the incentives except the bauxite and the free zone, which I'm told people are going to be looking at, are gone. It then says, unless you meet the following criteria, in broad sense, you don't access. You can't go to the minister unless you fit that narrow definition of a pioneer industry. You can't now go to the minister and say, I would like to have a waiver. There are other things that need to be looked at though. Tax reform, as we see it, is just one piece. We're just seeing the corporate income tax. There's a GCT to be looked at.
Yes.
We talk about merging the various payroll taxes. There are the different tax acts. So merging it doesn't mean just reporting it. It means, is the computation the same for NIS, the same for income tax, the same for NHT? There are differences in what you compute to determine how you come up with that. So there are more things that need to be done. This is a great start.
It's a great start, you
but
think?
there is a lot more to be done.
Yeah.
Let me just add.
I want to take a break at
one
this
thing to
point,
that.
Damien, but much more to talk about with regard to the omnibus legislation as well as the government's medium-term economic program. This is a special government on a mission looking at the government's strategy of fiscal prudence and the pursuit of a credible economic framework. We take a break. Welcome back to this GIS special, Government on a Mission, looking at the government's strategy of fiscal prudence. We have with us Ernst & Young tax specialist Alison Peart and the head of the Department of Economics, Dr. Damian King. And when we took the break, Damian, you wanted to say something on...
Yes, I wanted to point out that discretionary tax authority on the part of ministers
Yes.
gives up money in two different ways. One is that whatever ministerial discretion waives obviously will lose that revenue. And that is at least measurable. It's not capped, and that's a problem, but it's at least measurable. But it wastes resources in an entirely different way, which is not measurable. That once a minister has the discretion, it's an incentive for everybody in the country to lobby the minister to get that discretion.
Rent-seeking interest.
Ask the minister the number of applications that he gets to waive to waive taxes. And it is that lobbying effort and the amount of productive resources it uses that is the second wastage of resources. Now, once you codify all of this in legislation, then it is that second wastage of resources that you're eliminating, because there's nothing to be gained from lobbying the minister. You either qualify for it as it is written in the code, or you do not. So even if the very same amount of tax you are waiving, you put exactly that into the legislation, then at least you are saving the deadweight loss of the resources that would normally have gone into lobbying and can now be redirected into producing goods and services.
And that's actually a good point, in that there's more in terms of wastage. If you look at the staff at the Ministry of Finance, and if you were to look to see where their time was spent.
That too.
So part of what you'd want is you want your Ministry of Finance looking at tax policy, looking at how the country's money is spent. You want them to be able to be nimble, to be quick. One of the reasons we are viewed as being not the best place to do business is the speed of bureaucracy. You notice what I said? It's an oxymoron.
Yes.
Speed
of bureaucracy.
Correct.
Yes.
What that means is if you've got your staff tied up in dialogue to discuss, because you can't dismiss anybody. Anybody can pick up the phone and say, I would like a waiver under the old system. When you have your resources tied up in that way, then if you have genuine work to be done, whether it's tax legislation, or any kind of fiscal work, that's less time for them. And then you get into the rush, instead of having that time to do what you're supposed to be doing. So that's a good point, but it also adds that. The other issue that you have with the incentives that I'm not sure they were being tracked. It's very difficult sometimes to quantify when you give an incentive. If they've been given for so long, if they have no expiry date, it's just, there's nothing to...
If they're not tied to particular outcomes.
Plus, you could argue, and I'm not saying this is done, you could argue it props up certain businesses at the expense of others. So entities that ought not to have been for economic reasons, and I'm not getting to economic, for even from a tax reason. Because remember, we have an indefinite carry forward of losses. The issue comes up though, can you really survive if you only make losses? But the government allows you to carry your losses forward. One of the major changes that is coming through is that now, as of January 1st, 2014, only 50% of your taxable income in a year can be offset by a loss. So I'll give you an example. Let's say you had $100 of tax loss carry forwards, and you made $50 of taxable income in a year. Only $25 can be offset. You still pay some tax. So it doesn't stop you from carrying that that loss carry forward forever. You still carry forward. Right. It just means that when you're profitable, you pay something.
You still pay something.
Yes. Now, what's interesting is, and where I see a tweak will come up, or I'm not, you can't carry back your loss. So if you were profitable before and you suddenly have losses, you can't take them back. I'm not saying the government should. I'm just giving you a little nuance in it. It's something that the OECS territories do. So like St. Lucia, it's something that's done there. So it's not unusual. It's just that people need to be clear that it's not that the loss carry forward is restricted in terms of number of years. You just can't use up everything, because you could have a situation where, coming back to that same example, if you had $100 of profit and you had $100 of loss, you would have paid no income tax that year. at all. So it seems to be a situation where you're smoothing it. The other thing too that I find interesting is the employment tax credit.
Yes. Yes.
It brings in some complexity. It appears to be a couple of things. It is pushing people to file their payroll taxes on time, because if you don't pay it on time,
It's a good thing.
you don't, exactly.
Yes.
It pushes you to be in the net, into the formal net, because if you're not there, you don't get a credit. But then again, you can argue if you're not in the net, you're not paying taxes at all. The employment tax credit, though, is a little complex. People need to make sure they understand it. It is not given to persons who are in, like if you're a bank, etc. It is also not given to you if you pay dividends, and the tax on that dividend is less than 10%. There are certain clawback features to it that, and it's restricted to 30% of your taxes. So with the employment tax credit, it's there, but it's very restrictive, and people need to understand what the restrictions are.
Okay. Damon, your overall views on the omnibus tax legislation and how it improves what existed before. Large numbers of incentives to various sectors.
You see, when I say we, I'm just, talking about how economists like to view what are the key elements of a platform for economic growth. We think the tax code and reforming the tax code in Jamaica is what you call low-hanging fruit.
Yes, yes.
Many of the other issues, like balancing the budget, involve trade-offs, the kind of trade-offs we were talking about before. If you're going to balance the budget, you have to balance the contractionary influences in the short run with the benefit in the long run.
Yes.
You need good quality infrastructure that involves expenditure, which is going to, challenge you on the balancing the budget side to get the benefit in the long run, that kind of thing. Reforming the tax code is going to give you a fairer tax system, which is going to promote growth.
Okay.
It is going to bring in revenue, and it is going to allow you to deal with the equity issue more fairly. It has no drawbacks.
It has no drawbacks.
It has no drawbacks. A
Strong endorsement.
simpler, more uniform tax code improves on all fronts. There's nothing to be gained from a convoluted, complex, unfair tax system. There's nothing to be gained from it. When you have a tax system that uses up resources that can only be exploited by large companies that have to hire Ernst & Young to do all their work for them, and that have big tax departments, nothing is gained.
But Damon, when you take away the discretionary powers of a minister to make a judgment about an industry or a company that could make a significant difference to the economy, you're taking away potential wealth.
Let me say two things. People view paying taxes as punishment. If you are going to go about business in Jamaica and you want to drive on the roads and you want the police to be able to catch the people who pick your pocket, those are costs.
Yes,
those are costs that you have to cover
externalities
as a legitimate cost of business.
Yes.
You must pay for those costs. If you are only profitable by not paying for those costs, then you have a loss-making business and you should not be in business.
Yes, yes. But we're talking about using tax now as an incentive, Damien, by saying the minister.
That's what I'm saying.
Yes.
So it can't be an incentive for you to stay in business only if you're a loss-making business. You should not, therefore, if you can.
But you get tax for a few years.
I'm saying that if you can only stay in business by not paying taxes, then you should not be using up resources. You shouldn't be using up working capital. You shouldn't be using up labor. You shouldn't be using up factory space. Those resources must go into profitable businesses. Businesses that can cover all of its costs. And as long as you are usurping those resources while making losses and not paying taxes, you're holding the economy back. And the minister's discretion is stagnating the economy and wasting resources. And here's what the minister's discretion does. Just to recap the point that Alice was making a while ago. When the minister says, I am going to give a waiver to everybody named King resources get wasted in three ways. It loses the taxes from everybody named King. Then everybody named Peart starts to lobby the minister for the King waiver to be extended to the Peart waiver. So instead of Peart's producing goods and services, Peart's waste resources starting to lobby. Then the minister's staff has to expand twice. One, to deal with the application from the Pearts and the Mackenzies and from the Joneses. And then to expand further, because some of the Pearts and the Mackenzies and the Joneses aren't lobbying the minister for the extension. They are trying to get fake IDs to pretend they are kings.
That's right.
So they have to be
So
policed and caught.
Yes.
And corruption.
Corruption,
All
fast
of this
discovery.
takes place, because the minister has granted a waiver to people named King. Let's get all of that. Let's have everybody pay the same tax rate,
Regardless of your name.
regardless of your name, regardless of your industry, regardless of your business, and all the resources go to producing goods and services.
So we're moving in the right direction with
We
this
are
omnibus.
moving. And one thing I want to clarify with the loss carry forwards, there is a note, your first 5 years, you get full loss carry forwards, meaning full loss utilization. And if you make less than $3 million, whatever the GCT threshold is, that 50% restriction doesn't apply. So I just want to make it clear for people who are, oh my gosh, I'm a small businessman.
Yes.
There are some slight eases of it.
And I mean, this is not speculation, Talk to the people at the Ministry of Finance about what goes on with these applications.
They consume
They consume a lot of time.
inordinate amount of...
Correct. And to respond to your point with regards to, you do not want a complex tax code. As a tax specialist, one of the issues we have with the tax legislation is it's old. It's subject to a lot of interpretation, which means it's subject to discretion. Granted, you don't want too much, the minute you're too tied, you get into certain issues. However, there are certain fundamental basics that you need to make sure that your tax code is moving with the times. People talk about the U.S. The U.S. tax code is one of the most complex
Of course,
codes I've
absolutely.
ever
What
seen.
about people with hyphenated names? What about King Williams's?
There you go.
What
need-
about King's my maiden name,
Yes.
and I use my married name, but my real name is King?
That's
Yes,
waiver.
yes.
But we need to look very carefully at tax administration as well. Because the other issue that you get into is when you change the law, how it's administered is really the law.
So that's the other issue. Great to have had this discussion with you, Alison Peart, Damian King. Always interesting to chat with them. This has been a GIS special, Government on a Mission, looking at the government's strategic priority number 1, fiscal prudence and the pursuit of a credible economic program. I'm Ian Boyne.